if you've just woken up and switched on, about what happened overnight. Let's talk to GB News' Home and Security Editor, Mark White. I suppose, Mark, we ought to just catch everybody up with what's happened thus far.
Yeah, very significant strikes overnight that for the first time have involved the United States after so many days of wondering, will he, won't he? Donald Trump gave the go-ahead for US involvement in those strikes, targeting those 3 nuclear facilities at Fordow, at Natanz and at Isfahan. And we're told that 6 of these 30,000 pounds bunker busting bombs were used, probably most of them at Isfahan, at Fordow I should say, because that is the site that is buried deep into a mountain there, and just impossible for Israel to reach alone. That's why the US has been called upon to use its deep penetrating munitions. However, even those, it's doubtful whether they could get right down into the area where the nuclear enrichment is going, because it is so deeply buried through hard rock. But what it has, it seems, succeeded in doing, as of course the key members of the American administration were watching from the White House Situation Room as those strikes went in. What it has succeeded in doing at Fordow is to go after the sort of entry and exit points of that nuclear facility and bring down, it seems, thousands of tons of rock blocking the entrances and the exits. So that in itself will effectively render that site inoperable for the time being. And you can't imagine that Iran will be able to dig that site out anytime soon, because you have Israel with air superiority and able to continue bombing that site if they see any sort of excavation plans afoot, any sort of construction workers in there trying to repair the damage that has been done. Then in response to that, this morning we have had 2 waves of ballistic missile strikes from Iran that have targeted Israel, one after another, which is unusual. And we've seen in recent days the number of ballistic missiles launched towards Israel, and you can see the alerts there right over central Israel, including Tel Aviv and up in the north. And this is the result on the ground. Very significant damage. As I was saying, we were seeing of late some of the ballistic missile strikes, the numbers of missiles coming over from Iran had significantly reduced, and the thought was that the number of missiles available to the Iranians was being degraded very significantly. But in this particular 2 waves of strikes this morning, about 30 ballistic missiles have come over, and very worryingly there are reports that some of the warheads may have been packed with cluster munitions, which would explain the very significant damage that we are now seeing on the ground in central Tel Aviv and also in Haifa, that northern port city in Israel. The latest count for the number of injured stands at 11, but obviously rescue services still going through what are very badly damaged buildings at the moment, looking for those who may have been caught up in this. As we speak, there is another wave of Israeli Air Force strikes underway in Iran, aimed at taking out the missile launchers responsible for launching these ballistic missiles over this morning. However, what I will say there is that these missile launchers really are just being used by the Iranians as a one-time shoot and go, an abandon type scenario, because they know within seconds, minutes of the missile launch that the Israeli Air Force will be taking out these launchers. So that seems to be factored into what Iran is doing. The launchers are brought out, they launch, then they just abandon them, knowing that they're going to be struck by the Israeli Air Force. So the big question is, how many of these missile launchers and missiles do they still have available to them? As I say, the belief was that stocks were depleting, but even if the ballistic missile stocks are running short, they have many other missiles which are sort of the slower, lower moving cruise type missiles, which, if they're fired in significant quantities, can still breach the missile defence systems that Israel has, as good as they are.
I mean, the problem is, Mark, it highlights the sort of known unknowns in all of this, doesn't it? I mean, because we don't know quite what Iranian military capability is. We haven't had battlefield assessment at the moment. Oh, Mark, before we go into that, we've just had a response from the Prime Minister, who said Iran's nuclear program is a grave threat to international security. Iran can never be allowed to develop a nuclear weapon, and the US has taken action to alleviate that threat. The situation in the Middle East remains volatile, and stability in the region is a priority. We call on Iran to return to the negotiating table and reach a diplomatic solution to end this crisis. That's an interesting statement, Mark, in that the Prime Minister was calling for de-escalation just a few days ago, and yet he seems to be backing the US action.
Yeah, diplomatically, subtly, the language is changing, of course. What there wasn't in that statement, which is key here as well, was any confirmation that the British were involved in any way, shape or form in last night's strikes by Israel and the US, even to the point of, it seems, allowing the US to use the base at Diego Garcia. It seems those B-2 bombers that were used to drop those 6 30,000-pound bunker-busting bombs had come from other airfields. So Britain, for the time being, is not involved. I don't think that's a surprise. You know, the mood music that's been coming from the British government, the Labour government, as opposed to the previous Conservative government, as being increasingly sort of lukewarm to what has been happening in Israel, particularly with Gaza. You'll remember that just last week we got the news that 2 Israeli government ministers were being sanctioned by the British government. So there has been somewhat of a cooling off in relations between the UK and Israel. Having said that, you know, it's still an ally, considered to be an ally in that region. And if there was an all-out attack on Israel, there would be intense pressure, of course there would be, for the UK government to do what it has done 3 times before during the Iranian ballistic missile and drone attacks on Israel after October 7th and the subsequent strikes against Iran and against Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. The UK did get involved to help shoot down missiles and in particular shoot down drones with the use of Typhoon combat jets out of RAF Akrotiri in Cyprus, but no indication as yet that the UK government has any appetite at this stage for getting involved in this. And the hope has to be that, having launched this initial strike showing that the US is willing to strike out at these nuclear targets, that Iran perhaps now will come around the table, will look to serious negotiations, something that the US has said Iran just thus far has not been willing to do, that it has been a process of obfuscation from the Iranians for those 60 days that those nuclear talks were underway, achieving, according to the American administration, absolutely nothing.
That's very interesting, Mark, as well, there, because we've been seeing pictures throughout what you've just been saying of bomb damage in Israel. We haven't yet heard of any verification of what President Trump claimed was the total annihilation of the nuclear facilities in Iran. And yet, I guess because it's very much, or at least one of them is very much out in the desert, and you wouldn't be able to tell just from a satellite picture exactly the sort of extent of the damage that may have been wrought there.
Yes, absolutely right. And you wouldn't be able to tell, and the Iranians will certainly be accentuating the positive from their side, trying to portray a situation of limited damage to those facilities. And to that end, actually, they've had a reporter out from State TV saying that it looks as though the site at Fordo has not been badly damaged at all, that he could see nothing. The shot I saw, it looked like he was just standing on a road in the desert. There was no sort of facility that I could see behind him anyway. But, you know, that's Iran. They are going to do what they do, which is to claim victory on their side and limited damage from what Israel and now the Americans are doing there. I think the really interesting thing going forward will be not just the continuation of these missile strikes on Israel and how significant they might become, but will Iran, will its terrorist proxies in the region, in Iraq, in Syria, in southern Lebanon, in Gaza to an extent, although they've been that badly degraded, in Yemen, they're all threatening to do something. Will they actually target Israel, of course, but also US facilities in that region? That would then elicit I think a very significant response from the US in return for that. And what we haven't seen yet from the Iranians is any kind of targeting of shipping through the Persian Gulf and through that critical Strait of Hormuz, the narrowing of the Persian Gulf, an area that is so critical to a large part of the world's global oil and liquefied gas supplies. They could do that. They absolutely have the capabilities in their fast attack craft, their frigates and their mini submarines. If they wanted to do damage in that area and close down that strait, they could do it. Of course, realizing that it might be a bit counterproductive to them because they have their own sort of facilities in that area that could also be targeted. But if your backs are to the wall, they're going to strike out potentially.